My name's Rowan. I'm 24, and I just moved to Portland, Oregon, for a paid internship at a small graphic design studio downtown. The place smelled like fresh ink and coffee, its brick walls covered in sketches. With a playlist that never quite decided between indie rock and lo-fi beats, the job paid just enough to keep my student loans at bay, but nowhere near enough to cover rent in a city where even a closet-sized studio cost an arm and a leg. I'd been crashing on a friend's couch for a week, my duffel bag sprawling its contents across their living room. Then Mason, an old classmate from community college, texted out of the blue, "Dude, my mom's place has a spare room. Stay as long as you need. She's cool, I swear." I hesitated. Crashing with a friend's mom felt like stepping into someone else's life uninvited. But my options were dwindling. The next decent apartment wouldn't be available for weeks. And I was tired of pretending not to be stressed. So, I said yes. I showed up on a rainy Thursday afternoon. The kind of Portland drizzle that soaked through your jacket before you even realized it was raining. Mason's mom's house was tucked at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by maple trees heavy with their wet leaves. The exterior was a soft gray with white trim, the kind of house you'd see in a catalog, a neat lawn, a porch swing creaking faintly in the wind, and a single lantern glowing by the front door. I parked my beat-up Civic, grabbed my bag, and stood under the awning, water dripping from my hair. The door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there, maybe in her late 30s, wearing a loose beige sweater that slipped off one shoulder. Her dark hair was tied low, a few strands framing her face, and her eyes, green and warm, like they'd seen a lot but hadn't lost their spark, locked onto mine. She smelled faintly of mint, the kind that lingers in the air after someone's brewed tea. "You must be Rowan," she said, her voice calm, almost melodic. "Mason said you'd be here about now. Come in, you're getting soaked." I stepped inside, wiping my sneakers on the mat. The house was warm, genuinely lived in. Hardwood floors, a woven rug in the living room, books stacked haphazardly on shelves by the fireplace. A faint hum of jazz drifted from a speaker somewhere. It wasn't fancy, but it felt like a place where people actually breathed. "I'm Nina," she said, closing the door behind me. "Mason's upstairs, probably still on a work call. Let me show you the room." She led me down a short hallway past a kitchen where a kettle sat on the stove and a small vase of daisies brightened the count. The spare room was small but cozy. A twin bed with a navy quilt, a wooden desk under a window overlooking the backyard, and a single lamp casting a soft glow. My duffel looked out of place against the clean lines of the space. "The bathroom's across the hall," Nina said, leaning against the doorframe. "Towels are in the closet. Do you eat meat? Or are you one of those vegan types Mason keeps trying to convert me to?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Meat's fine. Coffee's better, though. Black. 2 sugars. Noted." She smiled. And it wasn't the polite kind you give a stranger. It was easy. Like she'd already decided I wasn't trouble. "Make yourself at home. I'm usually up early, so don't worry about noise." Might go out she left me to unpack, and I stood there for a minute, bag still in hand, feeling oddly settled. I'd expected awkward small talk, maybe a list of house rules. But Nina didn't seem like the type to fuss over things. I tossed my clothes into the dresser, set my laptop on the desk, and stared out the window. The rain had softened to a mist, blurring the edges of the trees. For the first time since I'd moved, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. That night, Mason finally emerged, full of apologies for being MIA. He was 22, lanky with a mop of curls and a grin that made you forgive him instantly. We caught up over pizza in the kitchen, him sprawled across a chair, me leaning against the counter. Nina joined us for a bit, sipping tea from a chipped mug, laughing at Mason's exaggerated stories about his job at a logistics startup. She didn't hover, didn't try to play mom. She just fit into the conversation like she belonged there. "You're lucky," Mason said, pointing a slice at me. "Mom's cool. She won't care if you leave dishes in the sink or blast music at 2 a. Me." Nina raised an eyebrow. "Within reason, Mason. I'm not running a frat house." I grinned, and she caught my eye, her smile softening. Something about it stuck with me like a song you can't shake. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. I shuffled downstairs, still half asleep, and found a mug already waiting on the counter. Black. 2 sugars. Steam curling up like it had been poured just for me. Nina was by the fireplace, curled up in an armchair with a book, her legs tucked under her. She didn't look up, but she said, "Figured you'd need that before you face the world." I mumbled a thanks, wrapping my hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into my palms, and for a moment, I just stood there watching the rain tap against the window. The house was quiet except for the soft crackle of the fire. Nina turned a page, her hair catching the light. I didn't know her, not really, but something about this place about her made the chaos of the past few weeks feel distant, like it belonged to someone else. I took a sip. The coffee was perfect, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't in a hurry to be anywhere else. The day settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected. I'd wake up to the faint clink of a spoon against ceramic, the low hum of the kettle, and the scent of coffee already drifting through the house. Nina was always up before me, moving through the kitchen like she'd memorized every creak in the floorboards. She never made a show of it, just left the mug on the counter, black with 2 sugars, positioned exactly where I'd find it. Some mornings, she'd be at the table scribbling in a notebook or flipping through a gardening catalog. Other times, she'd be out back, kneeling in the dirt with a pair of pruning shears, her hair tied up in a messy knot, sleeves pushed to her elbows. I started waking up early, not because I had to, but because I wanted to catch her before she disappeared into her routine. The studio didn't open until 9, and the commute was a quick bus ride, so I had time. I'd linger in the kitchen, pretending to check emails on my phone while she sliced apples or watered the herbs on the windowsill. We'd talk nothing heavy, just the kind of conversation that flows when you're not trying to impress anyone. "Are you always this quiet in the morning?" she asked one day, sliding a plate of toast toward me, only when I'm still figuring out if I'm awake. I said, taking a piece. She laughed, soft and low. "I've been up since old habit. Used to wake up for the kids, then for work. Now it's just me and the plants." I nodded, chewing. She didn't talk much about her past, but I'd pieced together enough from Mason's offhand comments. Divorced 5 years ago, she had 2 sons, Mason, the youngest, and an older one, Caleb. Off at college in Seattle, she worked freelance as an accountant, mostly remote, which explained the flexible hours and the way she seemed to fill the house with her presence without ever crowding it. "What about you?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Big plans for the weekend. Work's piling up." I said, "Deadlines? The usual. I might try to fix that wobbly shelf in my room, though it's been bugging me." She raised an eyebrow. "My handy dad taught me a few things before he split," I said, shrugging. "I like working with my hands. Keeps my head clear." Nina studied me for a second, like she was filing that away. "Good to know." The conversations grew longer. She told me about the flower shop she dreamed of opening back when she was my age, how she'd saved for it, sketched logos, even picked out a name, A Thistle in Bloom. But life got in the way. Marriage, kids, a husband who thought it was a cute hobby. By the time the divorce hit, the dream had faded into a box of old notebooks in the attic. "I still have the sketches," she said one morning, pouring herself more tea. "Sometimes I pull them out when I'm pruning the roses. Makes me wonder what I would have done differently." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just listened. There was something about the way she talked, direct but gentle, like she wasn't looking for pity, just sharing a piece of herself. It made me want to keep listening. Mason was around less and less. His job had him driving to client meetings across the state, sometimes crashing at a coworker's place to avoid the late-night haul back. The house started to feel like it belonged to just the 2 of us, me and Nina, moving around each other like planets in a quiet orbit. I'd come home from the studio, kick off my shoes, and find her in the living room reading or sketching in one of those notebooks. She'd look up, smile, and ask about my day. I'd tell her about the client who wanted a logo in Comic Sans, or the designer who cried over a misplaced pixel. She'd laugh, shake her head, and somehow make the chaos of my job feel less heavy. One evening, Mason texted. He'd be home late due to a work emergency. I was in the kitchen heating up leftovers when Nina walked in, still in her garden clothes, dirt smudged on her cheek. She held up a bottle of red wine. "Figured we could use this," she said. "Mason's not here to judge my terrible taste in Pinot." I grinned. "I'm not picky." When we ate at the table, just the 2 of us, the wine loosening our words, she asked about my family. My mom back in Ohio. My dad long gone. No siblings? I asked about hers. She talked about her older son, Caleb, how he was studying engineering and barely called unless he needed money. About Mason, how he'd always been the dreamer, the one who'd rather build something than sit still. About her ex. But only in passing a shrug, a sip of wine like he was a chapter she'd closed. "You ever think about leaving?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "Portland." She tilted her head. "Sometimes, but this house, it's home. The garden, the quiet. I spent too long building something to walk away." I nodded, understanding more than I expected. My own life felt like a string of temporary stops apartments. Jobs. Cities. This house, with its creaky floors and Nina's steady presence, was starting to feel like the first place I didn't want to leave. After dinner, I helped her with the dishes. Our hands brushed as I passed her a plate, and she didn't pull away. Her eyes met mine. Just for a second, and there was something there, curiosity. Maybe, or recognition. She smiled, small and knowing, then turned back to the sink. "Careful," she said, her voice light. "You keep helping like this? I might get used to it." I laughed, but my pulse picked up. The kitchen felt smaller. Suddenly, the air felt thicker. I didn't know what was happening, only that I didn't want the moment to end. The next few days carried a new kind of weight. Like the air before a storm, you can feel but can't see. Mason was around more, crashing through the house with his usual chaos, loud music, takeout boxes, stories about clients who couldn't make up their minds. But even when he was home, the space between Nina and me had shifted. It wasn't anything obvious. No lingering glances in front of him. No secret notes. Just a quiet awareness, like we'd both stepped onto the same unspoken page. One Saturday morning, I woke to the sound of a faint creaking from the backyard. I pulled on a hoodie and wandered out, coffee in hand. Nina was in the garden, wrestling with a wooden trellis that had collapsed under the weight of a climbing rose. Her hair was pulled back, a streak of dirt across her forehead, and she was muttering under her breath, trying to prop the thing up with a broom handle. "Need a hand?" I called, leaning against the porch railing. She looked up, squinting against the sun. "Unless you're secretly a carpenter, I'm fighting a losing battle here." I set my mug down and crossed the yard. Not a carpenter, but I fixed worse. She stepped back, wiping her hands on her jeans. "Be my guest." I knelt beside the trellis, inspecting the splintered wood. It wasn't salvageable, but I could rig something temporary. "Got any spare lumber or a saw?" "There's a pile of scrap in the garage," she said. "Already heading that way. Mason's dad left it years ago. Never threw it out." I followed her into the garage, a dim space cluttered with tools, paint cans, and a dusty workbench. She pointed to a stack of cedar planks in the corner. I grabbed a couple along with a handsaw and a box of nails. Nina watched as I measured and cut. Her arms crossed, a small smile playing at her lips. "You weren't kidding about being handy," she said. "Told you, keeps my head clean." We worked side by side, me hammering new supports into place, her holding the trellis steady. The rosebush was heavy with blooms, thorns catching on my sleeves. At one point, she reached to steady a branch, and her fingers brushed mine. Neither of us moved right away. The garage was quiet except for the scrape of wood and the distant chirp of birds. I could smell the sawdust, the faint mint on her breath when she leaned closer to point out a loose nail. "There," I said, finally stepping back. The trellis stood upright, sturdy enough to hold for now. "Not pretty, but it'll do." "It's perfect," she said, and the way she looked at me, like she wasn't just talking about the wood, made my stomach flip. We carried the tools back inside, and she insisted on making lunch as thanks. Grilled cheese and tomato soup, eaten at the kitchen table while Mason texted he'd be out all day with friends. The house felt like ours again, just for a couple of hours. She asked about my woodworking, how I'd started, what I liked to build. I told her about the bookshelf I'd made for my mom in high school, how it was still the only thing in her apartment that didn't wobble. She listened like it mattered, her chin resting on her hand, eyes steady on mine. "You should build something for yourself," she said. "Not just fixes. Something that's yours." I shrugged. "Maybe. Haven't had the space or the time." "You've got space now?" she said. And there it was again, that quiet wait. Like she was offering more than a garage corner. That evening, the house was still. Mason had crashed early after a long day, his snores drifting down from upstairs. I was in the living room sketching logo ideas on my tablet when Nina appeared in the doorway. She held 2 beers, condensation dripping down the bottles. "Thought you could use a break," she said, handing me one. I took it, our fingers brushing again. "Thanks." She sat on the couch. Not too close, but close enough that I could feel the shift in the air. The fireplace crackled softly, casting shadows across her face. She took a sip, then set the bottle down. "There's a window in the back bedroom," she said. "It's been sticking for months. Mason keeps saying he'll fix it." But she trailed off, smiling. "You any good with windows?" I laughed. "I've got a hammer and a YouTube degree. We'll see." She stood, motioning for me to follow. The back bedroom was small, used mostly for storage. Boxes of old photos, a sewing machine, a quilt folded neatly on a chair. The window overlooked the garden, its frame warped from years of rain. I ran my hand along the sill, feeling the give in the wood. "Needs sanding?" I said. "Maybe a new latch?" "I can handle it. I'll hold you to that." She said, leaning against the wall. Her sweater had slipped off one shoulder again, and I tried not to notice the curve of her collarbone in the dim light. She caught me looking but didn't call it out. Instead, she said, "Mason says you're good at what you do. Design. I mean, he's basit," I said, focusing on the window to steady myself. "But yeah, I love it. Just figuring out how to make it stick. Everything worth doing takes time." She said. "You'll get there." I turned to face her, and for a moment, we just stood there. The space between us humming with something I couldn't name. Her eyes held mine, searching like she was trying to decide whether to say more. Then she pushed off the wall. Her voice softened. "I should let you get back to your sketches." She brushed past me, close enough that I caught the scent of her mint. Sawdust. Something warmer. I didn't move until she was gone, my heart thudding against my ribs. The window could wait. Everything could wait. Because whatever this was, it wasn't just about fixing things anymore. The storm rolled in on a Friday night, sudden and loud, like the sky had been holding its breath all week. Thunder cracked overhead, rattling the windows, and the power flickered once, twice, then died. The house plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the occasional flash of lightning that lit up the garden in stark white. Mason had come home late, exhausted from a client dinner, and was already asleep upstairs. I was in my room, the attic space I'd claimed as my own, trying to focus on a logo revision when the lights went out. My laptop screen glowed for a second before shutting down. I sat there in the dark, listening to the rain hammer the roof, the wind howling through the trees. A soft voice floated up from downstairs. "Rowan, you awake?" I grabbed my phone, using its flashlight to navigate the stairs. Nina was in the kitchen, a candle flickering on the counter, casting long shadows across the cabinets. She wore an old t-shirt, sleeves pushed up, hair loose and slightly damp from the humidity. Her face looked softer in the candlelight, the lines around her eyes more pronounced, like the storm had pulled something raw to the surface. "You okay?" I asked. Stepping closer, she nodded, but her hands were busy rearranging spice jars on a shelf, a nervous habit I'd noticed before. I just hate when the power goes out. Makes the house feel too big. I set my phone down, screen up to add a little more light. "You scared of the dark?" "Not the dark," she said, glancing at me. "The quiet that comes with it." Thunder boomed again, and she flinched just slightly. I moved to the counter, standing across from her. "Want me to check the breaker? Might just be a tripped switch." "Already did," she said. "It's the whole block. Happens sometimes in these storms." She kept moving, wiping down the counter, even though it was already clean. I watched her for a moment, then reached for the spice jars. "Here, let me help." Our hands brushed as I took a jar from her, and this time she didn't pull away. She paused, her fingers lingering near mine, then let out a small laugh. "I'm being ridiculous, aren't I?" "Nah," I said, setting the jar in place. "Storms make everything feel heavier." She looked at me, her eyes catching the candlelight. "You don't seem fazed." "Grew up with tornado warnings," I said. "This is just noise." We worked in silence for a minute, organizing the shelves. The clink of glass was the only sound. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face, cheekbones sharp, lips parted slightly. She turned to grab another jar, and her back brushed against my arm. She froze just for a second, then stepped aside, but not far. "The house gets too quiet sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even when Mason's here, he's always got headphones on. Or he's out." "And Caleb?" he barely calls. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. My own apartment back in Ohio had been the same empty, echoing. A place to sleep. But not to live. Quiet's not always bad, I said. But, yeah, it can feel like you're the only one left. She turned to face me fully, leaning against the counter. That's exactly it! You get used to needing the noise kids running around. Someone to cook for. Someone to come home to. Then one day, it's just you, and the quiet's not peaceful anymore. It's empty. I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her. The candle flickered, throwing shadows across her face. She looked down at her hands, then back up at me. You ever feel that? She asked, like you're waiting for something to fill the space, but you don't know what. Yeah, I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be, more than I'd like. She smiled, small and sad, then reached for another jar. Her sleeve rhoda, revealing a faint scar on her wrist, thin, old, like a story she hadn't told. I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Instead, I took the jar from her, our fingers brushing again. And this time, neither of us moved to break the contact. We finished the shelf. The kitchen quieter now. The storm outside starting to ease. She blew out the candle, leaving just my phone's glow. In the dim light, she looked younger, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. I should try to sleep, she said. But she didn't move. Me, too, I said. But I didn't either. She took a step closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes. Rowan, she said, her voice soft. You ever feel like someone walks into your life at the exact moment you didn't know you needed them? My breath caught. I nodded. Barely. I think I'm starting to. She didn't smile. Didn't look away. She just stood there, the space between us shrinking, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. The storm rumbled outside, distant now, like it was giving us room to breathe. The rain had softened to a whisper by the time we moved to the living room. Nina carried the candle, its flame trembling as she set it on the coffee table. We sat on the couch, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the heat of her arm inches from mine. The storm's last rumbles faded, leaving only the patter of water against the windows and the occasional creak of the house settling. She pulled a blanket from the armrest, draping it over her knees. I used to sit out here during storms when the boys were little, she said, her voice low. Caleb would hide under the table. Mason would try to act brave. I'd read to them until the lights came back. I smiled, picturing it. You miss it. Parts of it? She said. The noise, the chaos, but not the rest. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. The silence between us wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, like it held everything we'd been circling for days. She reached for her book on the side table, then stopped, her hand hovering. You ever read this one? She asked, holding up a worn paperback. The Night Circus. It's about people who find each other in places they're not supposed to. And I shook my head. Haven't, but I like the sound of it. She opened it. Not to read, just to trace the cover with her thumb. I keep thinking about what you said earlier, about someone walking in when you're not looking. I swallowed, my throat tight. Yeah. She set the book down, turning to face me. The candlelight caught the curve of her cheek, the way her hair fell loose around her shoulders. I wasn't looking, Rowan. I gave up on that a long time ago, but you're here, and I don't know what to do with that. My heart was pounding so hard I was quite sure she could hear it. I'm not asking you to do anything, I said. I feel it too. She looked at me for a long moment, her eyes searching mine. Then she said, so quietly I almost missed it. If you don't want to sleep alone tonight, I can make more tea. It wasn't a come on. It wasn't a line. It was an offering, simple, honest, and heavier than any words I'd ever heard. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She stood, and I followed her to the kitchen. She lit another candle, filled the kettle, and moved with the same calm she always had. But there was a tremor in her hands now, a crack in the steady rhythm. We didn't talk much as the water heated. She handed me a mug chamomile, no sugar, and we took them to the porch. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and sharp. We sat on the steps, shoulders brushing, watching the water drip from the eaves. The neighborhood was dark. The only sound the soft rustle of leaves. I used to think love was supposed to be loud, she said, staring into her mug. Fireworks, big moments, but it's not, is it? It's this, sitting in the dark, drinking tea, not needing to fill the quiet. I nodded. Yeah, it's enough. She leaned her head against my shoulder just for a second, then pulled back. I'm not asking for anything, Rowan. I don't want to be alone tonight. I don't either, I said. We talked until the candles burned low about her garden, my sketches, the way Mason used to hide her keys when he was 10, about the things we'd lost and the things we still wanted. At some point, we moved back to the couch. The blanket pulled over us both. I don't remember falling asleep. Only the weight of her head against my chest, the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Morning came, gray and quiet. I woke to the smell of tea. Nina already in the kitchen, moving like nothing had changed. She'd brewed a pot of chamomile, 2 mugs on the counter, one on the left. Where I always sat, she didn't look up when I walked in, but she smiled. Small and certain. You're up later than usual, Munchie said. Didn't want to break the rhythm. I said. She laughed. Soft. It's already broken. Mason called that afternoon about a work trip he'd be gone for 3 days. I should have felt relieved, or maybe nervous. But I didn't. I felt steady. That evening, I carried my duffel up to the attic, the old reading room with its slanted ceiling and single window. Nina watched from the hallway, arms crossed, a question in her eyes. If you need space, it's yours, she said. No pressure. I set the bag down. I'm not going anywhere. Not yet. She nodded, and something shifted in her face. Relief, maybe, or hope. Good. Because I was going to ask if you'd come pick out flowers with me this weekend. The shop's getting new stock. I'd like that, I said. That night, Mason still gone, I found her in the kitchen rearranging a vase of daisies. She looked up when I walked in, her hands still on the stems. I'm keeping these, she said. They remind me of something. Me, too? I said. She didn't ask me to stay, and I didn't but when I went to the attic, the door to her room was open, a sliver of light spilling into the hall. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The air was clean. The world washed anew, and in that house, under that roof, no one was sleeping alone. Not because we had to, but because we chose to stay. Sometimes the one who stays isn't the first one you choose. Sometimes they're the one who shows up when you're not looking, with a mug of coffee, a candle in a storm, a question you didn't know you needed answered, and sometimes that's enough to build a life.